what we know from just physical climate science is that we do need to reach at least net zero CO2 emissions globally in order to hold the rise in global temperature. And from then, it's a very straightforward conclusion that unless we manage to reduce our actual emissions to zero, we do need some form of carbon dioxide removal to compensate for those emissions that we cannot reduce to zero. And it's also pretty clear that we will not be able to reduce all emissions of especially long-lived greenhouse gases like CO2, but also nitrous oxide and some of the synthetic gases completely to zero. And so there's a really logical necessity to accept that we do need carbon dioxide removal at a significant scale, because we will not be able to drive our emissions to total zero in an absolute sense at the global scale. There's a wide open question how much carbon dioxide removal we need, and that depends entirely on how successful we think we can be in reducing our gross emissions. If our main goal is to reach net zero emissions of long-lived greenhouse gases, but of course we may want to go beyond that and achieve net negative emissions, so to take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than we put in order to achieve a decline in global temperatures, because we have to remind ourselves that reaching net zero carbon dioxide emissions only stabilizes temperature at whatever level it will have reached. And if we decide that, say, a level of 1.7 degrees is distinctly too warm, then we may want to undertake efforts, and that will be consistent, of course, with pursuing 1.5 degrees under the Paris Agreement to bring temperatures back down again, in which case you need more carbon dioxide removal than you have as a remaining emissions. But the absolute scale is very much dependent on the efforts we can make in reducing gross emissions to as low levels as possible. So we certainly shouldn't see this as a physical necessity that large-scale CDR is needed under any circumstance. It depends, again, entirely on the scale of actions we are prepared to take collectively to reduce our actual emissions into the atmosphere to as low levels as possible. And in return, the more we think it is challenging to achieve large-scale carbon dioxide removal, the greater the incentive to actually try to reduce our gross emissions to very low levels, rather than rely on carbon dioxide removal as the necessary compensatory mechanism for the remaining emissions.